Christians and Jews believe that God brought Israel out of Egypt and that there was an actual historical exodus, as described within the biblical account. The skeptics sometimes go so far as to say there is no history to any of this, it's all a fiction, there's nothing to grab a hold of. Well, today the scholar we have takes a balanced approach and says there is some history here, but the story itself may not be what you think. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Super stoked about today's show. We're going to be talking about the Exodus. Like, when did it happen? Where did it happen? Or did it really happen? And what is it? A cultural memory? What does that even mean? And so, as you can see, today I have Dr. Ron Hendel. Thank you for joining me today on MythVision Podcast, sir.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Yeah. So I want everybody right now, check out the books, right? Recently, 5 views on the Exodus, historicity, chronology, and theological implications, counterpoints. This is like a book about, or a debate, if you will, among scholars on the various views of Exodus. When did it happen? And then finally yours, they saved the best for last on saying, did it even happen? And what is it? Cultural memory? What does that even mean? You're going to hear about that today. The book of Genesis, Fruit and Monotheism, Reading Genesis, 10 Methods, Remembering Abraham, Steps to a New Edition of the Hebrew Bible, Text Critical Studies. So we have someone in high caliber joining us today, if you will, on Hebrew Bible, these studies, the ancient studies of this text. And Professor Hendel has been a member of the Berkeley faculty, since 1999 and has served as chair of Jewish Studies, the Department of Near Eastern Studies, and a graduate program in ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology. Hendel, if you don't mind me saying that, approaches the Hebrew Bible from a variety of angles: history of religions, textual criticism, linguistics, comparative mythology, literature, and cultural memory. He is the editor-in-chief of the Hebrew Bible, a new critical edition of the Hebrew text, whose first volume was published in 2015. And to spare you guys reading the Bible of all the stuff he's done and the works that he has committed to, he has a PhD from Harvard University on the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew studies. And with that being said, the carpet is rolled out, and maybe you can introduce us to the Exodus. Did this thing happen the way that it is presented in the Bible? And don't you love the way I'm phrasing this? You're like, no, but if you don't mind, I'd like you to maybe elaborate. Like, everyone thinks that it happened in this period and that period, and this is how it happened. I like to say the maximalist position is exactly what the text says in the Bible is what actually exactly happened. What is your take on this, and how would you like to introduce us to the topic? Thank you.
Well, this is a can of worms. I would say, no, it didn't happen in the way that the story goes. But on the other hand, it's a great story. Right. And the story itself has an impact that I would say is more profound than merely historical events. But if you're interested in merely historical events, yes, so there's certain things that happened that gave rise to this memory. There's certain things that happened that gave rise to this story. And then once the story crystallizes, the story itself has certain historical effects. Okay, and those historical effects resound to the present day. So when you're talking about the past, when you're talking about history, when you're talking about events, it's really a complicated kind of a tapestry of different things that flow into this, different threads, different woofs, different weaves. And historical events, I'd say, are only part of the picture. Okay, so but there are historical events. There are things that happened that gave rise to this story. Now, let me just say, in any, and this goes to the question of what cultural memory is. Every people, every group, every country, every sports team has their own stories about their origins, about their heroes, about their history. I'm sitting here in the Bay Area, and I'm a big fan of the Golden State Warriors, and we have a kind of mythical history ourselves and certain heroes, and some of that, a lot of that is historical. Okay, we have this guy, Steph Curry, who's like supernatural and how he makes shots and plays the game. But there's legendary accretions, okay, and there's ways that the ways that one's memory of these events happens, the memory takes on a life of its own. So over time, these things become more and more legendary. Again, using the basketball analogy, mentioning names like Bill Russell, Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, Magic Johnson, these are historical people, but there's legends that go along with that. And as they say in Hollywood, if you have a choice between the legend and the history, you choose the legend, because that's what's powerful, that's what motivates you. To use another analogy, is as Americans, we all grow up with certain stories about what it means to be an American. And we're taught these stories. We're taught them when we're very young, okay? And the stories themselves are legends. And there's historical details in them, but they're legendary. Some of this, and let me say, once you learn what's historical and what's not historical, and what's in the story and what's left out of the story, these things become more complicated. So this is where we are today with the story of the Exodus. But let me go back to America. Nowadays, people talk about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and all of a sudden they're controversial because they own slaves, and Jefferson was having sex with one of his slaves, and this sort of thing. So there's all sorts of reckonings of actual historical events. But what we're taught as children is that these are legendary people. These are people that are perfectly good, that are role models, that embody certain values. And those values that they embody are values that we revere as Americans. Okay, George Washington, he's honest, he cannot tell a lie. I learned once that the story about George Washington and the cherry tree, which all Americans know because you taught it as a kid, it's part of our collective cultural memory. It never happened. He never chopped down this cherry tree, and his father asked him if he did, and little George says, "I cannot tell a lie." The first time we find this story was in a book by a minister written for children about the life of George Washington. And this book was written decades after the death of George Washington. No one had heard the story before. Okay, so historians are pretty confident that this story never happened. It's an apocryphal legend about George Washington, but it's the story that we all know.
That's what I was going to say.
It's the story that's part of our cultural memory.
It's one of those things that it almost is irrelevant to the public. Yeah. They're like, I don't even care.
Exactly.
Even though they'll say they care, especially when they have a vested interest in these stories. I think that happens. That becomes an issue. Like we find that with fundamentalists, because I was a fundamentalist myself, is that I had so much interest in like every word being inerrant, infallible. Like I had this strange magical view of things, so much so that everything literally had to have happened. And you would be popping my bubble big time with this episode today if I was still a fundamentalist, but I'm glad that I'm exploring these things. It's just, that's not what really leaves the impact, is whether it happened or didn't, doesn't matter. So what you're saying is the story, and that's what we're going to delve into on the Exodus.
It's the story that's the thing. And so the story about George Washington, I mean, we know George Washington existed. Okay, right. There's all sorts of empirical proof. I once saw in a museum, I mean, there's not only pictures, paintings of him and stuff. I once saw his wooden dentures on an exhibit in a museum. So there's empirical evidence. There's actual stuff you can look at that proves that George Washington existed. But this most famous story about him never happened.
Mhm.
And this most famous story about him is precisely what encapsulates these values of what it means to be an American, or what it ought to mean to be an American. These are the values that are encoded in the story that we're all taught. And in a sense, as you say, it doesn't matter whether the story is historically true, because the story is something that evokes a deeper truth that's beyond the merely historical. So let me say that the same kind of calculus, the same kinds of analysis apply to the story of the Exodus. Okay, it's the story that encodes certain values, and that contains a kind of worldview of how things work, or how things ought to work, and the kind of values that people internalize, that are taught to you as children, that are taught to you as a member of this community, whether you're Jewish or Christian. They're taught to you in a certain context, a tapestry of ideas and orientations, and that's what counts. Okay, so the story has value, it has truth, it has a kind of paradigmatic quality to it that is independent of whether the events really happened. And so that's what I want to emphasize. So it's not historically true. The story itself didn't happen, just like George Washington and the cherry tree. Okay, but that doesn't mean that it's useless, or you should, throw it away, or that it has no meaning, or that it hasn't been a profoundly powerful phenomenon in our history and in our memory. And so it's part of our collective identity. I mean, it's part of a particular group, or more than one group's uh, uh, cultural identity, and as such, it's very powerful and has had very powerful impacts from the Iron Age to today. So the fact that it didn't happen in the way that it's written is almost kind of accidental. I mean, it's kind of peripheral. It's kind of less important than what the story is, and what the story means and has meant for people. So you want to know what happened, though, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so we want to know this. We live in a society, a modern society, where historical inquiry is an important thing. But let me just add a warning. Historical inquiry has a warning label that goes to it. That historical inquiry can make these kinds of cultural memories complicated, okay, and can upset people, like telling them that George Washington never did this thing with the cherry tree. Like telling them that, Thomas Jefferson was kind of a weasel in certain ways. People take that personally, but it's true. He did this, that, and the other.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And nowadays, people are reevaluating things like, Thanksgiving. In the Bay Area, we have there's an actual anti-Thanksgiving that happens out in the Bay, where Native American people get together and have a ceremony, and they call it an anti-Thanksgiving, because they're not so thankful that the pilgrims came and took their land and wiped them out and things like that.
Yeah.
So, historical inquiries and even the historical memories of other groups can come in and kind of critique what those memories are. And then you have to say, well, maybe things didn't happen quite that way. Columbus Day, when I was a kid, was a big thing. Now in the Bay Area, it's called Indigenous Peoples Day. And you don't praise Columbus so much anymore. So this is what happens when cultural memories, on the one hand, are subjected to historical analysis, and are subjected to other people's cultural memories, with whom the previous cultural memory, they might differ with, or it might, be an oppressive memory for them. So this is my apology for saying we can look at what happened, but some people will be upset.
Most of my channel, just to give you a little bit of my audience, are
Okay.
critical thinkers. In
Okay.
fact, they are interested in the actual truth empirically. They want to know this did not happen.
Okay.
This did happen most likely because it's probabilistic. We have good evidence to inference this, that, and how your view, I'd love to hear this throughout if that's possible, how, because you do this in the book actually, how your view, for example, James K. Hoffmeyer, Professor Hoffmeyer, he's a smart cookie, but it'll be interesting to hear like the problems as we go,
Sure,
to say,
sure.
yeah, they just don't, they're forcing things in your estimation or whatever.
Yeah,
So
he was really pissed off at my contribution. I think he was pissed off that I was in the book. Uh,
interesting.
okay, so what happened? But I'm trying to set the stage here so that, you know, the word truth applies to historical inquiry.
Right.
But again, there's different levels of truth. There are truths of the values, the orientations, the things that the story has done, you know, and those are all true in a different way. Okay, so what's the historical truth? The historical truth is that, once again, these events in the story of the Exodus didn't happen historically. Okay, there were no, you know, plague of frogs that jumped out from everybody's kitchen cabinets, and the Nile didn't turn into blood, and all of that sort of stuff. Those things don't happen. Those are things that happen in stories. Okay, they don't happen in the real world. It also didn't happen that all of early Israel came from Egypt. Okay, archaeologists tell us that, and there's been a lot of archaeology of early Israel, and what they tell us, and I'm not one of them, so I'm just conveying what they say. Archaeologists have excavated a lot of sites from the places that became early Israel. So this is around 1200 BC when this nation crystallized into being a specific nation. And what the archaeologists tell us is that this was primarily an indigenous movement. That is to say, most of the people who belonged to early Israel had been Canaanites previously. They'd been local people. They were farmers, they were nomads, they were people who were shepherds, but they were mostly local, okay, who lived in the area of Canaan. And there's no indication whatsoever of any Egyptian cultural traits or architectural traits or pottery or anything like that. These are local people. What it looks like, and again, this is what the archaeologists tell us, is that in this period when the Egyptian empire was collapsing, and this is, I'm going to pick up on this in a minute. In this period when the Egyptian empire was collapsing and all of the lowland Canaanite city-states were also collapsing, big economic and political collapse, a lot of people moved up into the hill country. And the hill country of Israel, the hill country of Judah, the hill country of the north of Israel, this is where Israel came into being as a nation. Okay, and it started as a kind of small-scale tribal society, but we have this proliferation of small settlements, unwalled settlements, interestingly, in this hill country region. This is where Jerusalem is today, and much of ancient Israel settlements started there. These are small rural settlements. These are small rural people, and they moved there, and no one had lived there before. Okay, so it's largely unpopulated previously. So this is a kind of, in America, we understand this. This is kind of an opening of a new frontier, okay, where very few people lived before, and now this place could be cultivated, and you could live there, and you could get away from the chaos that was going on in this period of the decline of the Egyptian empire and Canaanite city-states and stuff. You could go up there, you didn't have to pay taxes to the Egyptians, and you could just have these little rural communities. Now, interestingly, they're unwalled, which means that they were peaceful. Okay, this was not a violent settlement. This was not a violent beginning of a nation. It was just a kind of migration into this new frontier. So these are, and all of their technology and their cultural patterns are all local Canaanite stuff. And when we later start having written materials, inscriptions and stuff, you know, it's all local. They speak a Canaanite language, which Hebrew is. Hebrew is a Canaanite language. And it's a Canaanite culture from the bottom to the top. So this is not the story that we have in the Bible. In the Bible, the story is that you have a massive movement of Egyptian slaves from Egypt to Canaan. There were 40 years wandering in the Sinai and so forth. And then a violent conquest of Canaan by Joshua and his armies. And you wipe out the Canaanites, and then the Israelites settle in there where the Canaanites had lived. That's not what archaeology shows us really happened. It was
Right.
a peaceful, kind of unspectacular, local phenomenon. So all of a sudden you have the question, well, these are local Canaanites. What's this whole thing about slavery in Egypt and liberation from Egypt and defeating the Egyptians and then defeating the Canaanites and the violent conquest of the land? How do you account for all that? A lot of biblical scholars just say, well, it's all fiction. Okay,
Right.
we can't account for it because it didn't happen. What I argue instead is that, well, there are things that happen that give rise to this kind of cultural memory of the rise of Israel as a release, as a liberation from Egyptian slavery. But it wasn't necessarily a liberation from Egypt on the part of hundreds of thousands of slaves and so forth. What happened, and I mentioned this a minute ago, the rise of Israel correlates with the decline and fall of the Egyptian empire.
Not because of the Israelites, though.
Not because of the Israelites. No. So what we, and the key ingredient to understand here is that the Egyptians had been ruling this powerful empire, and the region of Canaan was part of the empire for 400 or 500 years, from about 1500 to about 1100 BCE. So this is the part. This is the most glorious period of Egyptian history. The big statues of Ramses II and all these great New Kingdom pharaohs. They fill all of the museums in the world. So it was a very wealthy, powerful time for Egypt. It was a world power, and Canaan was its northern province. So this is the region that Israel arose in. Okay, but Israel arose at the time that the Egyptian empire was collapsing. Now, what I want to stress is 2 points. One, when Egypt was ruling over the land of Canaan, it exacted a lot of tribute from Canaan, and this tribute included slaves. So there actually were a lot of Canaanite slaves that were taken down into Egypt. Okay, they weren't Hebrew slaves as such, they were just Canaanites. But a lot of them were taken down to Egypt. Whenever a new pharaoh came to the throne, he would go to the northern province and have some wars there and take captives, and this would assert his authority, during his reign over this foreign territory, so that they wouldn't rebel. So there were always, whenever a new king would come, you'd get more Canaanite slaves taken down into Egypt. These were prisoners of war and stuff, but they would take them down and they would work for the pharaoh and for the temples in Egypt and so forth. There also was a large slave trade during this period, where people would sometimes, because if you were a Canaanite and you were bankrupt or you owed a lot of money, you could sell family members into slavery. And this is a horrible thing, but something that people did. Mm-hmm. And so there was a slave trade where you could, because of debts or something, you could sell your children into slavery. You could sell them to a middleman and they would take them down to Egypt. The story of Joseph gives us a glimpse of this. There's these Midianite and Ishmaelite traders that going back and forth between Canaan and Egypt. And Joseph's brothers, first they want to kill him. They throw him into a pit and they say, let's kill him. And one of the brothers says, let's not kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. And so they sell him to these Midianite traders, and the Midianite traders take him down into Egypt and sell him to a buyer in Egypt. So this is actually something that happened particularly during this imperial period. The people would sell Canaanites into slavery in Egypt. So through these different mechanisms, there ended up being a lot of Canaanite slaves in Egypt. Okay, So this is one of the important things. Now, what happened to these Canaanite slaves in Egypt when the Egyptian empire collapsed? Many of them simply stayed and became Egyptians. Some of them, and we don't have a lot of evidence of this, but there's some indications that some of them went back home to Canaan. So at the end of the Egyptian empire, you probably had some Canaanite slaves returning home to Egypt.
When you say some, you just mean some. Like the biblical narrative really puts some
Exactly.
numbers on
You
this.
don't have 600,000 men plus women and children
If you were to make a guess, and I mean completely guess, because that's all it is, what would you put on a number?
We have one text that says that I think 2 Canaanite slaves escaped from Egypt. Okay? And they went past the guard post at the Nile Delta, and they managed to slip past. And we have a letter from someone who the guards are reporting that these 2 Canaanite slaves slipped past the gate. And what should we do? And the guy says, go after them. And then we don't have any reply after that.
Oh, man.
So we have proof that 2 of them, we don't know whether they made it out. But, I would guess hundreds, maybe thousands. Because if the economy collapses, what do? You're working for these temples, you're working for the royal imperial institutions, and if they collapse and you can't eat, you're either going to go find another job locally, or you're going to go back home and survive, on your agricultural farm of your uncle.
I don't want to take you off the path because you're on a wonderful path, and I definitely want to learn like the factual evidence basing that on the cultural memory, but I kind of want to jab occasionally just to like throw
Sure.
curveballs in there to have you address something. There are people who are watching this right now as we speak who say, dude, duh, the Israelites were Hyksos pharaohs. They were the Hyksos Egyptians that what can we somehow address that throughout this in a way too?
So before so I'm addressing the period when Israel arose, and this is the period of the Egyptian Empire, and particularly the period of the collapse of the Egyptian Empire. Now, before that period, a couple hundred years before that, there was a dynasty of Egyptian kings, of Egyptian pharaohs that have Canaanite names, and these historians call the Hyksos. So this is this is a dynasty of pharaohs. They were overthrown by the people who were some of the founders of the Egyptian Empire. Okay, and so this is a change of dynasty. There's, I think, some indication that when they were overthrown, some of them went back to Canaan. Okay, but there probably weren't very many of them. And anyway, that's 500 years before the Exodus happened in biblical memory.
Okay.
So one of the points that the Hyksos brings into play is that for a long time there had been Canaanite communities in Egypt. Okay, and the Hyksos dynasty probably comes from a local Canaanite group that was living in Egypt. So Egypt was a big, Egypt was a superpower at the time. And so people would have moved from Canaan. It's like moving to New York City or moving to Los Angeles or moving to London. You go where the business is. You go where the big economy is. So there were Canaanite communities in Egypt out of which these Hyksos came. But then the Hyksos were overthrown and nothing much happened after that. But that's 500-600 years before the rise of Israel. And again, I'm going back to this archaeological stuff, this picture of how early Israel arose. Mm-hmm. So the Hyksos period, I don't think really contributes much to this historical memory. Now, maybe, people say maybe the memory of Joseph as a kind of vizier to Pharaoh might harken back to this Hyksos period when you actually had Canaanite pharaohs. But even there, the in the New Kingdom period, in the Egyptian Empire, you actually had Canaanites who did rise to high positions and were viziers in Egypt. We have several people who were very high people in the pharaonic hierarchy who were Canaanites during the imperial period. So I think that's probably more what's reflected in Joseph, because Joseph is not Pharaoh. He's just a high-ranking official in the royal hierarchy who is a Canaanite. And we have many examples of those, or at least, 6, half a dozen examples of those.
And that right there would be cultural memory as well, right? The
And
Joseph
that would be
story.
cultural memory as well. But again, I think it's cultural memory. It's more likely to be cultural memory of the imperial period, which is the period just before Israel arose,
Right.
than this Hyksos thing, which is much farther back and is actual pharaohs who are Canaanite. Now, let me say that in later Egyptian cultural memory, they did conflate the Hyksos period with what they had learned about the Exodus from the Bible. This is much later in Egyptian history, after the Bible had been translated into Greek, which was the language of Hellenistic Egypt. So later Egyptian history actually does conflate the Hyksos story with the Exodus story.
Is this why Josephus gets this mixed up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is exactly where Josephus gets this stuff.
Wow.
So the Hyksos stuff does, in the history of the cultural memory of the Exodus, the Hyksos stuff does get folded in because the Egyptians remembered the Hyksos, and they were bad guys, total bad guys. So they conflate those Hyksos bad guys with the story of the Exodus, where Moses is a bad guy.
I think Manetho does the same thing with Moses, connecting him to an evil Hyksos, right?
Exactly. So Manetho and Josephus, this is all coming from, these are Hellenistic historians drawing on biblical traditions and old Egyptian traditions.
Thank you for answering that, though. I'm sorry I took you off the path for a second, but
you know these things, and they factor in, and they're part of the bigger picture. So back to history. Okay, so there were Canaanite slaves in Egypt. There's no question about that. And it's very likely that when the Egyptian Empire collapsed, some of them returned to Israel. But these weren't 600,000 men plus women and children. These were slaves emigrating back home after the economy collapses. And some of them may well have become members of this new rural community in the highlands that called itself Israel. Okay, so there is a connection with Canaanite slaves who were actually in Egypt and may have escaped from Egypt. Now they escaped because the soldiers weren't guarding the gates anymore, because they had lost their jobs, because they weren't being paid anymore. Now, the other bigger picture, I think, is that every Canaanite who was in Canaan, who never went to Egypt, was a subject of the Egyptian Empire for 400 or 500 years. Okay, and according to the ideology of the Egyptian Empire, they were all slaves of Egypt. So everybody living in Canaan, which includes all of the people who became early Israelites, they all had a memory, an actual historical memory of being, politically slaves of Egypt.
Because when they'd come, they'd pick up slaves. When they came, they looked at them like, all right, where's my chattel? Where's my slavery? My workforce. Give me my workforce. Is that the kind of mindset that they had?
Well, it's that and other things. So when the Egyptians were there, they used local Canaanites as their workforce. So they used them for slave labor. And we have documents about that. We have these documents called the Amarna letters. And these are letters from local Canaanite rulers during the period of the Canaanite Empire. It's a correspondence from local Canaanite rulers with the Pharaoh. And so we have the correspondence between Pharaoh and these local guys. And these local kings are saying, in one of them, he says, I provided a workforce from my people to work on these pharaonic lands in, let's say, the Jezreel Valley. And so this is historical proof that, local Canaanites in Canaan were slaves of Egypt in Canaan. because Egypt was the ruler. Now, even more than that, we find in these Amarna letters that the Canaanite kings also say, I am your slave, O Pharaoh. So the language of empire, and this is something I stress, the language of empire defines all of the people in Canaan, including the kings, as slaves of Pharaoh. And they legally are slaves of Pharaoh. Pharaoh owns them. Pharaoh owns the lands of Canaan, and he can work whatever fields, whatever fertile fields he wants, he just claims. And the people there are legally his slaves. He can do whatever he wants with them, including the king. So everybody in Canaan, from the king down to the lowest peasant, were slaves of Pharaoh in an ideological and political sense. Even if they weren't working the lands, they were his slaves. And as such, they had to pay the taxes. Every year you have to pay a certain amount of your crops and so forth. Precious metals. Sometimes the Pharaoh would the annual taxation included people. You have to send slaves down to Egypt from the local population. So everybody, in their subjective sense of who they were, saw themselves as slaves to Egypt. So this is what I would say is the cultural memory of the Egyptian house of bondage that's remembered in the Exodus. Okay, you don't have to be in Egypt to be in Egyptian slavery. Everybody in Canaan was in Egyptian slavery for 400 or more years. So what happens when the Egyptian empire collapses? All of a sudden, you're not a slave to Egypt anymore. You're so-and-so living in the villages of Canaan. You were a slave of Egypt, and now you're not. Well, that's a great miracle. Okay, and some of those people move into the highland areas and start this new community. In their community, their founding story is that we were all slaves to Egypt. God saved us. God defeated Egypt.
Took us out of Egypt, what doesn't necessarily mean we were in Egypt, but Egypt itself, we are no longer in that.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's, in a sense, it's an exodus from Egypt, but it's because the Egyptians are the ones that withdrew from Canaan. But we're not in Egypt anymore, but it used to be Greater Egypt. So, and we're not slaves to Pharaoh anymore. So we can serve Yahweh as our Lord instead of serving Pharaoh as our Lord and master.
So does this play into the conquest? I'm sure I'm skipping ahead, aren't I?
Yeah, well, the conquest, that's a difficult question. First of all, you have God, Yahweh conquers Pharaoh. So this is the first step of the conquest. God defeats Pharaoh and Pharaoh's armies. And you have this happening at the Red Sea. Okay, so, and this separates Egypt from Canaan. I mean, they have to wander for 40 years, but the Red Sea is the place of separation. So you are liberated from Egypt when you go across there, and it's because God defeated Pharaoh. Now, in a sense, for the early Israelites, they did have a kind of separation from their previous lives. Okay, but their previous lives may have been in the Canaanite lowlands or something like that, and they moved to the highlands. So there's a kind of journey there, but they remember it as being separated from Egypt, as a liberation and an exodus from Egypt. So you can see how this geographical picture of escaping from Egyptian slavery being remembered as actually being slaves in Egypt, and God liberates you from there and defeats Pharaoh. You get to go back into Canaan and be a free, independent people serving Yahweh instead of Pharaoh. You can sort of see how that would work for these people. Okay, Egypt was all over the place. Egyptian culture, Egyptian power. There were huge Egyptian garrisons, military garrisons in Canaan. There were the Egyptian tax collectors and so forth. So you saw the Egyptians all over the place. You were just in Greater Egypt, not in Egypt proper. Now, when we factor in that there were probably some actual escaped slaves who physically did come from Egypt, they bring, a memory of an actual journey and an actual passage. And you somehow have to kind of shake that up with what the local people are remembering. And there you get a lot of the ingredients of the story of the Exodus.
It's kind of like saying, imagine if, for whatever reason, when everything happened in the Americas slavery, all right, and Africans are coming from Africa, imagine if, no more slaves, and a lot of them came back home, so to speak, not millions, but 1,000 or a couple hundred or whatever, and they came back home. It's like that memory of their story combined with the fact that we don't have Europeans over here and other people trying to constantly take us and control us and tell us what to think and how to do and what to do. All of that combined becomes this narrative. And here we have this narrative. Now, it's obviously embellished and mythologized into a beautiful image. My question then would be, is it possible that the conquest of Joshua into this narrative is inner fighting between Canaanites? Or how would you reconcile the cultural memory of the conquest of Joshua? And maybe this is a whole podcast of its own that we should do.
Yeah, well, this is part of the story. Okay. And let me just say that, the story of American slavery is, on the one hand, kind of an analogy, but it's also very tied in with the Exodus story. That is to say, for the Black slaves, the Exodus story was a very powerful story for them and was one of their ways of desiring liberation from slavery, and a way of criticizing their white masters by evoking the Exodus story. And, things like Moses went to Egypt land, let my people go. When slaves sang that in antebellum South, they were saying, masters, you guys, let us go.
Yeah. I saw a nice video about Martin Luther King Jr.
Yes.
And he
used Exodus language all the time. So in the civil rights movement, the African American civil rights movement, and in the period of Black slavery, the Exodus story was a very powerful vehicle for expressing what the desire for liberation and explaining liberation itself after the fact. The Underground Railroad, for them, that was like the Exodus, Harriet Tubman and stuff. So these are stories that, in a sense, create a way of articulating the reality that you're in. And I argue that this happened not just for American slaves, but for the very early Israelites. In other words, that the story itself kind of crystallized their sense of who they were and where they came from and what their values and orientations were, that the story itself helped create them as a people.
Okay. As simple as this, to put it in very basic sense, this story, this cultural memory story, wasn't embellished 1,000 years later, hundreds of years later. From the start, this narrative had formed, crystallized at the beginning, and it was always memorized or remembered this way throughout not only Israel's history. This had such an impact. You have Martin Luther King Jr. standing there saying, let my people go. This cultural memory may live on for thousands of more years, and people will still I suspect, utilize this in different contexts, because that's what a story can do. It can mold, it can form into any current context that you're going through. Like me, this horrible job, my boss is a pain in the butt, let my people go. I'm just saying, like, you could use it almost it's more serious, of course, in its original context and with Martin Luther King Jr. and the slaves in America. But nonetheless, people use this story to their own advantage. And that's your argument, is from the get-go. This was the story.
The story, the instrumental power of the story helped to create a people. And the story created their sense of common identity, common goal, common memory of traumatic history. And it crystallized who they were as a people, creating the glue that created early Israel itself.
That's powerful. And I just want to comment to say, you're not only talking about the Exodus and the situation, you're actually giving a scholarly point of view of the existence of the origin of Israel as a
Yeah.
nation.
Yes, I
That's
am.
a lot. There's a lot there that I can
Yeah,
imagine that
it's very important.
creates.
Yeah.
So what happened with Joshua in this whole I know we keep tapping into it, but
Yeah.
how do you explain it?
So this is another puzzle, and this is a puzzle again that the story that I told earlier about what archaeologists tell us about early Israel makes the Joshua story very problematic.
Hmm.
That if early Israel was an indigenous, peaceful movement of people into a kind of new frontier where mostly people hadn't been living before, then that means the story of Joshua and the conquest also didn't happen historically.
Right.
So then the question is, how does that cultural memory come into being? And that's a tough one. Um, there's a couple of ways. There's a couple of things that I would say about that. One of them is that one of the things that the story of the conquest does is create a difference between the people of Israel and the other Canaanites who didn't become Israel. Okay, so in a sense, the story of having a battle with the Canaanites and defeating them and displacing them creates a strong boundary around the group of early Israelites, saying we're not the same as them. Okay, that we had a war with them, we won the war, and so we're different than them. We are our own people, and it's different. Being an Israelite is different than being a Canaanite. Now, historically, we're saying that they weren't that different from the Canaanites. They were Canaanites, and that they're creating a new identity that, in a sense, they're inventing these cultural boundaries between the Israelites and the Canaanites. By saying they came from outside and they conquered the Canaanites is a way of drawing boundaries and saying, no, we're not Canaanites at all. We defeated them. Now, let me give another analogy that I think helps, again, with early America. So when I grew up, they taught us that the British were the bad guys. Okay, we fought against the bad, they were redcoats and they shot people in Concord and in Boston and stuff. And the good Americans were fighting back against them with guerrilla tactics. And because of George Washington and other things, we won. We defeated the bad guy British, and they left. And so it's kind of a David and Goliath thing. But we were the good guys, they were the bad guys, they left. Well, at a certain point, I learned that all the earlier colonists for those 12 colonies, 13 colonies, I keep confusing it with the 12 tribes of Israel. That's because of the biblical roots here. All those colonists were British culturally. They were Brits. They, most of them thought that the King George was divinely chosen, and they were culturally British. I mean, the big thing, they threw this tea into Boston Harbor. Who drinks tea? They were all English. That's why they drank tea so much. So culturally, historically, they're English. What they're doing what these stories do is all of a sudden say, no, we're not English. We're Americans. They're inventing a new identity. And in order to invent a new identity, you have to cast off your own old identity and say that old identity belongs to other people who are the bad guys.
I think this also explains, I love this analogy. This is so evident in the way you just described this. And so then we create things, even in our laws, that separate us from them. And so, like the fact that they're not to eat pig, or they particularly have certain laws. I guess to ask in that vein, I don't want to get lost in it because I know we're into the Joshua and what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
But since they've created a bubble of their own people, now we have clear evidence that like Canaanites ate pigs and things like this that were obvious. Is there any evidence in the archaeology here signifying that, like, you get where I'm going with this?
But it actually goes a slightly different way. It
Okay.
was actually the Philistines that ate pork.
Okay.
The Philistines, who came from the Greek area, from the Aegean, they ate pork and they loved pork. The Canaanites didn't eat pork.
Oh, okay.
And so the Israelites didn't eat pork either because they were just not accustomed to raising it. Apparently, I mean, maybe growing pigs has more of a financial investment or something like that. I'm not a farmer, so I don't know. But Canaanites didn't eat pigs either. So the idea that the Israelites don't eat pigs is a continuity with their Canaanite heritage. What the focusing on eating or not eating pigs shows up in the archaeological evidence when you look at Israelite and other Canaanite sites versus the Philistines. So that's a boundary that gets drawn between the Israelites and the Philistines. And once Israel gets established as a people, that's exactly the same time that the Philistines are settling on the Canaanite coast, and you start getting military conflicts between this new nation of Israel and the Philistines, which is, you know, what we see in the stories of Saul and David and Samson and so forth. So it's that cultural boundary that's starting to be formed between the Israelites and the Philistines, where you get these food laws starting to crystallize and becoming very important culturally.
Is there any evidence in the law or the law codes? Because it's, you know, there's various sources here. That's one thing I love about actual scholarship and not fundamentalism is we have multiple sources playing a role here. But is there any evidence that signifies in the historical record of like Canaanites practice this, but when the nation of Israel becomes a nation, they purposefully do something different? I mean, obviously they're borrowing the God, Yahweh, if you will. There's
Mhm.
this adaptation of many things Canaanite, which is one of the
Yeah.
reasons we also would say, look, we have a good reason these come from Canaan. But is there any evidence to say, hey, we're establishing something new, and this is a new law that separates us from our own kin?
Yeah, that's harder to find. At some point, the idea of monotheism becomes a big dividing line. I think it's a fairly early point, uh, because the whole idea, and it's built into the Exodus story, that because Yahweh delivered Israel from Egypt, therefore you shall have no other gods beside me, because I'm the one who has protected you. So monotheism, or at least this idea of exclusive loyalty to one God, is part of this Exodus pattern, part of this Exodus story. You know, I Yahweh, brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Therefore, you shall have no other gods beside me. This is where the Ten Commandments begins.
Right.
So, you know, it might be, and I'm sort of speculating here, but it might be that monotheism, or at least this exclusive loyalty to one God, is one of the traits that started to make Israel actually different from its Canaanite neighbors.
So that would be kind of, if it's not monotheism, it'd be a henotheism kind of, but
Yeah, a henotheism. It's also called monolatry, meaning the
right.
serving of one God. So this seems to be one of the boundaries, and certainly it's one of the boundaries that the biblical text sees as distinguishing Israel from the other nations.
Do you think there was an influence from Akhenaten ideas of a henotheistic? I say that because there's a lot of online people who have these, oh, I know the Israelites are Hyksos, or they always have an idea. The original monotheist was Akhenaten, and they think there's some correlation there. But what's
Well,
your
I think it's fair to say that the original monotheist was Akhenaten. Whether Akhenaten, what in Egyptology they call Akhenaten's heresy, it was, you know, declared heretical by all the Egyptians after Akhenaten, after the reign of Akhenaten. Whether that affected the religion of Israel a few hundred years later in various different circumstances, I'm not sure I see a mechanism for that.
no genetic connection, but it is interesting. If it's a heresy in Egypt, it's like, you know what? We're going to show those Egyptians. We're going to adopt this heresy. No, I'm just teasing.
Yeah, well, this was Freud's theory, and he picked that up from some Egyptologists who had
Huh.
advanced that theory.
That was a
I
guess
just
on
don't,
my part.
I just don't see how you can connect the dots. Really, I think it's perfectly fine for it to be an indigenous movement,
It,
but I think there is a broader background that of ideas of gods becoming more transcendent is something that we see in this period. In this period more generally, including Akhenaten, including early Israel.
Professor Hendel,
So there are some like wider intellectual streams that might connect those ideas.
if I may, I would like to see, if you don't mind, what are your criticisms? What your book does this. So anybody who's watching, you got to go see, not only read his books, but the 5 views on Exodus. You're going to see the contention here. But can you give us a quick, well, however long it might take you? I'm just saying, like, address James Hoffmeyer, Professor Hoffmeyer's view specifically, because we currently have a couple people who are in the YouTube world that are using his work, or they fall in line with Hoffmeyer's thesis on the Exodus. What are your major, I guess if I put like my hand up and said 5 fingers, problems with his position?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So Hoffmeyer is a real scholar. He's a real archaeologist, and so he knows what he's talking about. My criticism would be his general methodology. So what he does, and he picked this up from previous, so he's an eminent evangelical scholar, Protestant evangelical, and he picks up his methodology from, I think, one of his teachers, who was Kenneth Kitchen, who was a British evangelical scholar, and Kitchen, I think, picked it up from other people. What they tend to do is they start with the presumption that the Bible is inerrant. Okay, so that's a starting point. It's certainly not the starting point that I start with, or that other scholars in universities, research universities, or liberal arts colleges start with, but it's where evangelicals start. So already you know that the
I'm with you.
The inquiry is going to be shaped around the concept of biblical inerrancy. So how do you demonstrate the truth of biblical inerrancy? Well, what Hoffmeyer does and what Kitchen does and other evangelical scholars do is they pick and choose historical details of historical realia from texts or from archaeological evidence that in some ways illustrates the idea that the Bible is inerrant. So, for example, if the Bible says that the Israelites built Pithom and Ramses, okay, when they were slaves in Egypt. So people like Hoffmeyer and Kitchen will say, oh, well, look, here's evidence that the city of Ramses really existed, and it existed at this particular time period, and therefore the story is true. In other words, it's like in my critique, I would say that's the same argument as saying that, a Shakespeare play about Julius Caesar that has a historically accurate detail about ancient Rome, let's say, they wore togas. The fact that they're wearing togas in this play doesn't mean that the play is historically accurate in all of its details. It's only historically accurate in some of its props. You see what I mean?
Right.
So they're pointing to different details that are like props in a theater production. And they're saying, yeah, let's look at this prop. Yeah, the city of Ramses really existed, and it existed at the right period, so therefore everything else is true. That's a fallacious argument. I could tell you lots of stories that are totally not true, but throw in some props that look real or that are real. So what Kitchen and Hoffmeyer don't do is look at the details that aren't historical. They leave all that out because they're incapable of looking at those details because of their commitment to the Bible being inerrant.
I think you said that really,
This is what they do. And so you can fill a book with little details about, where the city of Ramses was and what might have been, and what the name of Pithom is actually an Egyptian word, per atum. and you can do all this sort of stuff, which shows that the background detail, or some of the background details in the story, are historically accurate and may even evince historical memories that come from that period.
That makes me wonder, just the loan word question, if you will. How do you address that? There are biblical loan words, and uh, some people will go, "That's clearly a sign." I mean, they're being conquered and ruled by Egypt, so I could see the language being necessary to know in order to cord. I
Yeah.
got to talk to you, man. So you got to know something from Egypt.
So
But
this is something
yeah,
that Kitchen and Hoffmeyer do all the time too. They'll say, well, look, this word for linen is an Egyptian word. Well, yes, that's absolutely true. Uh, Egypt was, as I said, a major superpower, an economic power. To this day, we talk about really nice sheets being made of Egyptian cotton. Okay, they're expensive. And so linen in the ancient world, I don't know much about it, but maybe the good stuff came from Egypt, and it's an Egyptian word. But that means nothing about any particular story or episode in which Egyptian linen is mentioned. Similarly, a lot of words in Hebrew, the words for ink and pen are Egyptian loan words. Well, that's interesting. And this arguably stems from the period of the Egyptian Empire in Canaan. Every bureaucracy operates by paperwork. And the same was happening in the Egyptian Empire, where you had Egyptian scribes using papyrus and pens and inks and so forth. And so it's kind of natural that the Egyptian words for those things would have been borrowed into Hebrew at the time and became the standard words for pen and ink.
interesting.
So you can infer certain historical processes behind some loan words and things. If loan words are borrowed in a certain domain and not in other domains, you can sort of say, oh, well, there's connection there. But none of that has anything to do with whether the Exodus story in the Bible is inerrant.
I love this. I want
It's
to
a
poke.
disconnect. It's a non sequitur kind of argument that these people use.
What do you say to someone who says, well, Potiphar is an Egyptian name, and the way that the narrative plays it, he has a wife, they have a slave in the house, and it plays out almost like what would really happen in ancient Egypt. Like they know too much. How do you address that?
Yeah, well, if you're talking about a guy who's in Egypt in your story, you want to have a word for the master of the house that sounds Egyptian. You do that today. Let's say in a movie, you've got some, German guy who's a foreigner. Well, what you do in movies is you have him speak with an English accent, and that's how you know he's a foreigner. You have devices to communicate that this is a foreigner. And so in the story, you have the Egyptian master, and so you give him an Egyptian name. Or a name that sounds Egyptian. It doesn't even have to be a real Egyptian name. It just has to sound Egyptian. So if you have, a Russian spy, you name him Boris. Okay, Boris and Natasha. It doesn't mean that the story of Boris and Natasha originated in Russia or the Soviet Union. It just means that you know some Russian names that you give the characters in your story. So it's a meaningless inference. I mean, to say that it's an Egyptian name means nothing in respect to the historicity of the events.
Right.
Because
Just those.
you and I can think of names like that ourselves. I just thought of Boris and Natasha, and I know nothing about Russian spycraft.
Yeah. Or Juan and Lopez, or
Yeah.
something from down in the, some Spanish.
You know,
Right.
if you're an ancient Israelite and you don't know any Egyptian names, then you're sort of an idiot.
Interesting. It sounds to me there's tension there, though. Professor Hoffmeyer, is it because, do you think that his presupposition of this inerrancy has caused him to view you in a certain respect for that? I mean,
Oh,
it's
of course.
obvious. Yeah.
Anyone who, well, I mean, you can tell me within that community, if you critique people who are using inerrancy as biblical inerrancy as part of their methodology, you're going to
Yeah.
say, well, you're the devil's spawn or something like that. That's part
Well,
of the discourse. So he's not
I
going to like me. I mean, I don't know why he doesn't like me personally, but he's angry when I say things like that.
well, I respect that you say that. Actually, I'm glad that you're just laying out the truth, and this has been a wonderful conversation about the Exodus and Joshua in particular. I I
Let me
guess
just, let me just add one thing about. I
please.
have some very good friends who are evangelical scholars, and
Right.
respect each other's boundaries. And I tell them, what you do is really hard because you have so many tripwires as an evangelical scholar. You say one wrong thing and you're fired. Whereas I can say all sorts of stupid things and they don't fire me. So it's hard to be an evangelical scholar, and they have, things that they cannot say or else they lose their jobs.
Mm.
So, when he has to say I'm a bad guy because I critique the idea of biblical inerrancy being part of his methodology, he has to say that, or else he'd lose his job. So I don't take it personally that he's a bad guy for doing that. He has to do that.
Oh wow. Yeah, that's kind of well, let me ask you this in the vein of our previous lecture you gave, you brought up a Stilly or Stilly that Israel's name was on this, and it talks about these people I've destroyed, these people are no
Hmm.
more, the seed of Israel is not. Okay. Do you think it's possible? Because this is around somewhat around this time frame.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Do you think that the Egyptian abuse on the Canaanite regions may be the narrative picked up and taken and said, oh, we were the ones who conquered these regions in their mythology for the Joshua conquest? Do you think that that conquest could fit that in some historical verisimilitude, even though it wasn't historical? They're saying we conquered, actually, not them.
I would put I would put that. So this is called the Mernepta Steely. It dates to about 1207 BCE, and it's a wonderful document from one of the last. It's from Mernepta, who was the successor of Ramses II. Um, so this is the period when the Egyptian Empire is declining, but Merneptah is still strong enough to go into Canaan and to whack a bunch of local people who are presumably rebelling against Egypt, sensing weakness. This is part of the, I would say, grievances that the early Israelites would have against the Egyptians. This is part of the Egyptian oppression, that Egypt came in and whacked us when we were just this little tribal peoples in the hill country. This flows into the narrative of Egypt being an oppressor and and a slave master who is now attacking and killing the slaves. So I would put it back. I would put it back into this story of this is an exemplar of Egyptian oppression and why we we remember the powerful hand of Pharaoh and are so happy that Yahweh finally defeated them. So I would put it into that storyline. I don't think you'd put it into the story of the Israelite conquest because this is being conquered, not
Mhm.
being a conqueror yourself.
I just was wondering where you think they picked up the conquest motif, you know?
Well, the conquest motif, I would say, comes from a couple of different angles. One of them is when Yahweh conquers Egypt, and the story develops such that Israel is physically moving into Canaan, that Yahweh keeps conquering people so that the Israelites can settle in their country. And this is one of the earlier versions of the story. Now, in the book of Joshua, it's Joshua and the armies that are going in there. But in an earlier layer that we already see in Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, where Yahweh defeats Egypt, it says Yahweh is going to defeat the Canaanites. That they're stumped, they're shocked, they're silenced in awe at Yahweh's conquest. And this continues in other parts of the story where Yahweh simply stuns them into submission. In some versions, he sends a hornet ahead of him to defeat the Canaanites. In others, Yahweh goes himself. There's a wonderful version in the book of Amos where Yahweh goes and defeats, Amos chapter 2, where Yahweh goes and defeats the Amorites himself.
Right.
After the Exodus. The Israelites aren't doing any of the job. It's Yahweh who's doing the defeating himself.
So this
I
might be
think there's
multiple.
an earlier version of the story where it's just Yahweh defeats the Canaanites as a sequel to his defeat of Pharaoh.
Sorry for interrupting you. I didn't mean to. I think there's just a slight delay. So when I actually start and you're already, it's like, so this seems like the documentary hypothesis could play a really good role. And I'm saying that to say overall, there's multiple sources. And this might be the Joshua and the Exodus might be a conflation of the same narrative, so to speak. But the redactors might be actually trying to make it sound like, oh, well, this is a later story after they get here. Now they're conquering. It's really the same, potentially the same story.
It's very much the same story in these earlier phases of the story. In Exodus 15, you see that the Israelites are going across and Yahweh's defeating the Canaanites and Yahweh's planting them on his holy mountain, which is arguably Jerusalem. So they're already conflated in the very earliest version of the story that we have. But your point is a good one, that there are different layers of the story and they take on different forms and different configurations. And I would say the one where the Israelite armies are the ones fighting is one of the later layers. Earlier, it's just Yahweh.
Dr. Hendel, I cannot tell you how fascinating this has been. I please, everybody, get his book. Go down in the description, get his books. I have to have you back. This has been a serious pleasure because I can't think of a single thing you said that I personally don't agree with. Like this was, and I don't try to find people that I agree with completely. It's like I want to learn, and I say that to say like I learned so much today from you. But it fits so many of the pieces that I've been trying to figure out. Like, how do you make sense of this? And it just makes more sense in the real world, especially when we have contemporary examples. And I say contemporary, like past 300 years, examples that we can look at and go, huh. I mean, yeah, we have a nation established and coming from the very people they're claiming to no longer be. Why would Israelites say they're not Canaanites? Well, they're establishing a new nation, a new people. And I can't tell you how excited this makes me, but I hope that everybody goes down there and does this. And thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. And I really appreciate your enthusiasm about this stuff. And let me say, you know, as a historian of religion, as a scholar of the Bible, these are historical and explanatory models that I'm constructing here. And it's not like I have some sort of insight into the absolute truth or what actually happened. You know, and certain things I could say could be overstatements or could be wrong. And sometimes I'm extrapolating from the data. So, you know, this is just what scholars do. And, you know, we try to make better explanatory models, but I don't want people to think that just because I say it or you're enthusiastic about it, it's necessarily true. You always have to subject these things to criticism and improve them or destroy them and so forth.
This makes me, I'm sorry I have another question because you make me have to. I don't know why. It must be some secret power at work here. No, I'm just teasing. I must ask you, where do you, how does Dr. Hoffmeyer and the others look at Israel as a people? Do they believe that they were Canaanites initially? How do they explain it?
Well, no, they say they were, you know, there was Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then they went down into Egypt, and then they were Hebrews, and they came, so that they weren't Canaanites.
They were from the Ur of Chaldees, so to speak, technically.
Well, you know, and if you look at the genealogies in Genesis 10 and so forth, the Canaanites are a different branch than the Israelites, who are descended from Eber and so forth. So they would say they're totally unconnected to the Canaanites. So they would have to say that all the things that archaeologists tell us is wrong.
That's what I thought.
Which is hard to do.
Oh, I'm sure I'll get 100 more questions in my head, and I can't do that to you. That's just not fair to you. I really do appreciate you. Let's get you to come back and let's talk about the dating. I really want to hear what you have to say, because we've had quite a few minimalists come on the channel and say, look, this dates to the Hellenistic period. I love when there's some contention there, at least in the sense that you're going to say, no, we're going to flip that on its head. I'm going to show you why we need to think older. And I know that you think older because I've actually watched your lecture on this some. I'm interested, though, in probing into it and seeing how you might answer these questions. So I appreciate it.
It gets technical pretty quickly, so I'm just warning you there.
I'm sure that's going to be way over my head compared to the Exodus discussion, because I don't know linguistics, and
Yeah.
that plays a huge role in understanding this, but I will do my best to try and keep up with you.
I'd be happy to.
Thank you so much. Everybody go down in the description, check out his books, like the video, share this content with someone you know who is interested in this topic, even if they don't agree. I'm interested to hear what they have to say. And don't ever forget, because sometimes we forget who we are, right? We are MythVision.